The conference hall in Geneva was quiet, too quiet for a day like this. Delegates shifted in their seats. The United Nations emblem loomed behind the speaker's podium like a tired symbol of broken promises. Cameras flashed, pens scribbled, but no one breathed freely. Everyone knew something was coming. Netanyahu, older but no less defiant, stood at the center of the stage. His hands gripped the podium like it was a weapon. With a cold glare sweeping across the room, he began not with pleasantries, but with fury. "We do not apologize for our strength," he growled. "We do not ask for permission. And we will continue our operations, with no mercy and no delay." He didn't mention Gaza directly. He didn't have to. The delegates knew what operations meant. They'd seen the footage, the dust clouds over Rafah, the children pulled from rubble, the screams under the silence of international complicity. Yet, most stayed silent. Except one. Across the room, seated like a lion forced into a chair, Ibrahim Traoré raised his eyes. No script. No advisor whispering. Just the weight of the African continent behind him and the ghosts of every child lost in war. He rose slowly. Not rushed, not provoked, but deliberate. The room turned, as if gravity itself was shifting. Netanyahu's speech had ended. But now, the real statement was about to begin. "I've heard this story before," Traoré said calmly, voice steady but edged with steel. "Told by men who wear suits over blood, who speak of peace while ordering destruction." Netanyahu smirked from his side of the stage, but it faltered, just slightly. Traoré walked to the podium, not waiting for applause, not needing it. His presence was enough. "You say no mercy," Traoré continued, "then do not expect any from the truth. Because truth is not diplomatic, it is deadly." Gasps fluttered through the crowd. Reporters leaned in. In one sentence, the entire narrative of control had begun to crack. Outside, protesters chanted in multiple languages. Inside, the temperature dropped, but not from the air conditioning. The real storm hadn't started yet. But everyone in that room, especially Netanyahu, could feel it coming, and it wore the face of a man unafraid to confront power with truth. The air thickened the moment Traoré's words echoed off the marble walls. A low murmur swelled, like the distant rumble before an avalanche. Netanyahu leaned back slightly, the smirk now frozen on his lips, not quite a grin, not quite gone. For years, he'd faced presidents, prime ministers, and UN envoys who bit their tongues and hid their rage. But Traoré? He brought no mask. "I know what you mean by security," Traoré continued, voice rising like a drumbeat. "You mean checkpoints that strangle movement. You mean silence bought with bombs. You mean children who learn the word drone before they learn to read." The hall had gone silent, not out of respect, but shock. These were the words that never made it into official transcripts. The kind of truth that lived in the cracks between paragraphs, the kind editors sliced out to keep their jobs. Cameras snapped furiously now, each flash a spark thrown onto dry kindling. Delegates exchanged glances, some nervous, others quietly nodding. Among them, an ambassador from South America whispered, "He's saying what we all think." Netanyahu stood again, microphone already active. "You speak from the luxury of distance," he fired back. "You don't understand the cost of restraint, the threat we live under every day." Traoré didn't flinch. "And what do the people of Gaza live under?" he asked. "Is their suffering not real because your map colors them differently?" He took a slow breath, then pointed, not at Netanyahu, but at the cameras. "Let history record this moment," he said. When a leader said, "We occupy without mercy," and the world heard him. No edits. No spin. Let every child who buries their brother tonight know who spoke, and who stood silent. There it was. The rupture. Some clapped, timidly. Others stared, locked in place by the weight of what had just been said. Netanyahu remained rigid, but even from across the room, you could see it, the flicker of something unspoken in his eyes. Not fear, not yet, but recognition. Traoré wasn't there to win applause. He was there to rip off the mask. The silence after Traoré's last sentence wasn't empty, it was charged. Like the stillness before a storm that you know will tear the sky in two. Netanyahu remained frozen, gripping the sides of the podium like a man steadying himself on a ship that had just started to sink. His eyes darted, toward U.S. delegates, toward European allies, but found no immediate rescue. Traoré turned from the mic and slowly began pacing. Each step echoed like a verdict. "You speak of fear, Prime Minister," Traoré said, his voice deliberate, low, yet heard by all. "You live behind walls, tall, armed, electronic. You have the might of one of the world's most powerful armies. But the people you occupy have none of that. And still, they resist." A large screen above the chamber lit up, unplanned. Traoré's delegation had prepared visuals. Images flashed: a bombed-out schoolyard, a woman holding a lifeless child, a boy with half a face staring at the camera, alive but forever altered. There were no captions. None were needed. "You build empires on their pain," Traoré said without turning to the screen. "Then call them terrorists when they scream." The chamber broke. Voices rose, not in protest, but in panic. Delegates fumbled with earpieces, translators caught off guard, murmurs spilled into gasps. Someone from the UK delegation demanded the feed be cut. Another from France said, "Let him speak." Netanyahu slammed his fist against the podium. "This is propaganda," he shouted. "We've been under siege for decades. Our people live in fear of rockets, tunnels, knives." Traoré stopped walking. He looked Netanyahu in the eyes. "And the people of Gaza live in fear of living," he replied. Gasps again, audible this time, then applause. Not many. Not loud, but enough to shift the ground beneath Netanyahu's podium. Traoré raised a hand. The screen went black. "No more images," he said. "They are not here for your approval. They are here to haunt you." Netanyahu's lips curled into a smirk, but it wasn't confidence, it was desperation in disguise. He straightened his jacket, leaned into the microphone, and said coldly, "Your outrage is dramatic, but irrelevant. The world knows what we've endured. We protect our nation. We do what's necessary." Traoré's response came not with fury, but with silence. A silence that lasted long enough to make the room uncomfortable. Delegates shifted in their seats. Cameras zoomed in, and then, slowly, Traoré leaned into his own mic and said, "Necessary?" His voice was calm, surgical. Was it necessary to bomb hospitals marked with red crosses? Was it necessary to cut off water to millions? Was it necessary to leave children digging through rubble for their parents? He paused again. Then, "Do you know what we call that, Mr. Netanyahu? Where I'm from, we call that war without soul." The American ambassador looked down. The German delegate wiped his glasses. And somewhere in the back, a UN staffer whispered, "This is history being written." Netanyahu scoffed. "You have no idea what leadership requires. You speak with emotion. I speak with responsibility." Traoré didn't blink. "Responsibility isn't measured in craters, Prime Minister." He turned toward the General Assembly and asked, "How many here have walked through a refugee camp? Smelled the sewage? Held the hand of a mother whose family was buried under concrete slabs dropped from the sky?" Not a single hand went up. Then Traoré's voice rose, not shouting, but firm enough to shatter illusions. "You can quote strategy. I will quote names: Amina, age 6. Youssef, age 10. Layla, 37, pregnant. You erased them in the name of order. I remember them in the name of truth." Suddenly, his words weren't just a challenge to Netanyahu. They were an indictment of every leader who had looked away. And no one, not even those allied with Israel, dared to interrupt. Traoré didn't sit down. His eyes scanned the chamber, room full of diplomats in tailored suits, delegates clutching neatly printed statements, all pretending neutrality was virtue. But the room felt different now. The air hung heavy. No one could look him directly in the eye. "Do you think I came here to exchange pleasantries?" he asked. "Do you think I flew halfway across the world to sip coffee and nod while a murderer defends genocide?" Netanyahu narrowed his eyes, but Traoré didn't look at him. He was speaking to the world now. Diplomacy died under rubble, he said. You buried it with the children of Jabalia. You think statements and ceasefire resolutions will wash away blood? They won't. He turned to the Palestinian delegation, silent, eyes glassy. They don't need your silence. They need your spine. And if you won't speak, I will. Then he pivoted again, staring directly at the U.S. ambassador. You fund him, he said. So don't pretend to be shocked by what he does with your money. Gasps rippled through the room. Whispers sparked like wildfire. The American delegate stiffened, face turning pale. But Traoré wasn't done. He pointed toward Netanyahu. He talks of resistance to terror. But he is the terror. His soldiers bulldoze homes, burn olive trees, and laugh while Gaza bleeds. And still, Traoré added, he claims the moral high ground. He finally turned to face Netanyahu fully. You're not a leader. You're a symptom of a world that confuses might with right. Netanyahu's face flushed red, fists clenched beneath the table. But Traoré wasn't afraid. History won't remember your borders. It will remember your bombs. And me? I will make sure it remembers your victims' names before your excuses. The room had stopped breathing. No one dared to speak. Not even Netanyahu. The chamber stayed frozen for a long moment after Traoré's speech. You could hear the faint whir of translation earpieces, the shuffle of papers, the sound of power trying to compose itself. But no reply came. Not from Netanyahu. Not from the Americans. Not even from the Europeans who usually stood ready with diplomatic band-aids for bleeding crimes. The silence was deafening. Traoré stepped away from the podium. He didn't need a mic to be heard anymore. His words had carved themselves into the marble walls. You all heard me, he said, pacing slowly, eyes locked on the Israeli delegation. And your silence tells me everything. Netanyahu's advisors were visibly rattled, one whispering frantically into a phone, another scribbling a rebuttal that would never see the light of day. Netanyahu himself sat frozen, jaw tight, trapped in the echo of a truth too loud to ignore. Then came the breaking point. From the gallery, a Palestinian observer stood up. Quietly at first. Then he raised his hand, and in Arabic, he said, "You are not alone." Another voice followed. From South Africa. Burkina Faso speaks for us. Then another, Senegal. Then Bolivia. Then Malaysia. One by one, nations that had once stayed on the sidelines stood up, not to debate, but to align. Netanyahu's grip on the narrative was crumbling, not by bombs or resolutions, but by the one thing he couldn't control, moral clarity. And Traoré watched it unfold with calm defiance, as if he'd seen it coming all along. He turned to Netanyahu with one final glance and said, "This isn't just about Gaza anymore. This is about you, losing the room." He walked back to his seat, slow and deliberate, while the sound of applause, slow, scattered, then thunderous, filled the hall. Not for war. Not for power. But for a man who made silence scream. Back in his seat, Traoré sat upright, not triumphant, but focused. Around him, ambassadors and delegates leaned toward one another, whispers flying like sparks in dry grass. The General Assembly had not expected a confrontation of this magnitude. They had certainly not expected this African leader, young, blunt, unmoved, to seize the global microphone and light it on fire. Netanyahu, however, was not finished. He stood. Not with the usual pomp, not with the iron voice he used on Israeli television. His eyes burned, not with confidence, but with fury barely masked as dignity. "This is slander," he said, voice shaking slightly. "This man represents chaos. He aligns with terrorists, cloaks hate in rhetoric, and dares to stand in this room and dictate morality?" The hall didn't move. So Netanyahu tried harder. Israel will never apologize for defending itself. We will occupy, we will strike, we will do whatever is necessary to survive. He turned toward Traoré, voice dropping to a threatening whisper, and men like you will regret turning this body into a court for murderers. That's when Traoré stood again. Slowly, calmly, like a man lifting a sword only when it's time to strike. He didn't look at Netanyahu. He looked at the room. You hear that? He said, motioning to the Israeli Prime Minister. He still calls it defense. Traoré took a breath, scanning each row of ambassadors. Let me be very clear. There is no defense in bombing sleeping children. There is no survival in crushing the voice of an entire people. And there is no honor in threatening silence with more blood. He stepped toward the center once more, eyes now meeting Netanyahu's directly. You call it war. I call it cowardice in uniform. You wear fear like armor and expect us to bow. And you threaten me? He asked, his voice cold steel. Then say it louder, Netanyahu. Let history hear you. The room didn't breathe. And once again, Netanyahu said nothing. The room hummed like a wounded animal, nervous, unpredictable. After Traoré's last salvo, small clusters spread through the chamber like oil on water, murmurs, raised phones, faces lit by screens replaying the exchange. What had been a routine UN session had become a referendum on shame. Netanyahu sat rigid, jaw working like a man chewing on something bitter. Around him, the usual scaffolding of support began to wobble. Old alliances depend on ritual and habit more than conviction. When a ritual breaks, the structure cracks. A French foreign minister leaned toward his colleague and whispered something that did not reach the microphones but traveled nonetheless, through translators, through embassies, through back channels. The phrase was simple: this cannot continue as usual. Traoré watched those little fissures the way a chess master watches pawns. He didn't gloat. He catalogued. You speak of necessity, he said softly into his mic as if continuing a previous thought. But necessity isn't measured in casualty counts. It is measured in conscience. When conscience dies, necessity becomes an excuse. The German delegation, a place where procedure rarely yields to passion, stood quietly. Then the representative from Brazil. A ripple of stands began to travel along the rows, steady as a tide. Each nation that rose did so for a reason: a refugee crisis at home, a past wound inflicted by foreign intervention, a diaspora calling for accountability. They stood not only out of sympathy for Gaza, though that was real, but because they were tired of being told which losses were tolerable. Within minutes, the weight of that collective motion pressed on the Israeli corner like an unseen hand. Netanyahu attempted to reclaim the narrative. We are defending our people, he snapped. We face real threats. You would strip us of the right to survive. Traoré's reply was a study in controlled fury. Defense isn't an unqualified license to erase, he said. Defense doesn't hollow a hospital and call it strategy. Defense doesn't feed its propaganda machines and then beg the world for silence when the cameras look away. A younger delegate, a woman from a small island nation whose climate battle had taught her the cost of ignored voices, stood and spoke without script. When our children drown crossing seas, we call it tragedy. When their children die beneath bombs, we call it collateral damage. Who decided the language? Who decided which lives count? Her words landed like stones. Backstage, aides scrambled. Phone lines lit. Ambassadors convened a huddle that looked less like damage control and more like confession. The calculus of geopolitics, contracts, basing rights, strategic partnerships, trembled under the raw arithmetic of human grief. Traoré stepped forward, not to gloat but to offer a hand. If you choose to rebuild together, he said, voice steady and low, let us rebuild on dignity, not extraction. Let treaties be about education and water, not profits and permissions. It was a pivot from condemnation to construction, classic in rhetoric, rare in practice. The rhetoric worked because he offered an alternative that felt real: concrete programs, timelines, names. He invoked villages in Burkina Faso that had replaced foreign rice shipments with community fields, and he invited nations to pilot similar programs for Gaza's recovery. The room changed its angle. Diplomacy re-entered, but on new terms. Allies who had once nodded at the word stability now asked the next question: stability for whom? Netanyahu's threat, "We will occupy without mercy," had been meant as a claim of absolute control. Instead, it fractured the illusion that power alone could command consent. Traoré's answer, "Then die without honor," was not a call for vengeance but a verdict on impunity. Outside, the world's feed spiked. Streets filled. Opinion columns rewritten midday. And in corridors where maps and resource charts usually dictate conversation, a different ledger opened: names, ages, villages. People began to demand not just what their leader said, but what they would do. When the session finally recessed, it left the old scripts in tatters. Traoré walked not as a victor gloating, but as a man who'd given the room a new vocabulary: accountability, restitution, dignity. Power had not been seized with a single blow, it had been reclaimed slowly, in the cumulative weight of standing up. And somewhere, in a quiet office, a diplomat faxed an emergency memo: reassess commitments. Reframe language. Prepare for reconstruction proposals. History, it seemed, moved in memos as much as in speeches. Outside the UN building, the air had changed. What had begun as another day of bureaucratic repetition, resolutions stacked like paperweights, nodding diplomats reciting lines approved by foreign ministries, had been ruptured by Traoré's defiant cadence. But inside, the fracture wasn't just diplomatic. It was philosophical. As the delegates filed out, some solemn, others stunned, Netanyahu remained seated. Not because he had nothing to say, but because, for the first time in years, his words no longer commanded the room. Silence now echoed where applause used to answer him. He finally rose. And then, in a move that startled even his inner circle, he walked straight toward Traoré. The cameras snapped like a frenzy of insects. Advisors panicked. Was this a confrontation? A handshake? A trap? Netanyahu extended a hand. Cold, calculated. His voice low, almost performative: "We'll see what your righteousness builds when the rockets start falling again." Traoré didn't flinch. He didn't take the hand either. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a photograph. A child. Covered in dust. Eyes still open. Body still warm in memory but long buried in Gaza's ash. He held it up. Not for Netanyahu. For the world. "This is what your mercy looks like," he said. The gesture wasn't violent. It was surgical. Surgical in the way truth slices deeper than rhetoric. Surgical in the way one image can dismantle 10 years of state-crafted narrative. Netanyahu's smirk faltered. The room held its breath. Then came the moment that would flood timelines and history books. Traoré turned toward the cameras and said, "You built your empires by calling us savages. You flattened our lands, erased our names, extracted our gold, our oil, our bodies, and told us it was order. But now, it is your houses that tremble. Your alliances that crack. You feared the day we'd speak like this, calm, clear, unshaken." He looked directly into the lens. "We are not rising in rage. We are rising in clarity." Outside, protesters across the world had begun to chant his name. Paris. Nairobi. Ramallah. Chicago. Cape Town. Not in frenzy, but in unison. Because something ancient had shifted. A colonial reflex was being broken in real time. And behind him, the mural of flags, each one representing a state, a people, a history, suddenly looked less like a backdrop and more like a mirror. One by one, leaders began issuing press statements. Some vague. Some panicked. But a few, remarkably, stood firm. Norway announced it would pause all military exports to regions engaged in active civilian targeting conflict. Chile called for an emergency summit to reassess the UN's veto structure. And Burkina Faso? It invited representatives from Palestine to a recovery forum, not as victims, but as equal architects of the future. That evening, as Netanyahu's motorcade left under heavy security, a child in Brooklyn drew a picture. One figure small but unbending. The other large but shouting. Above them, in crooked handwriting, "Truth is taller." Traoré didn't need statues. He needed moments like that. Moments that rewrote what power looked like. Night fell over New York, but the lights of the UN still burned like a theater refusing to close its curtains. Outside, barricades kept the crowd at bay, but their voices, their chants, their rage rolled over the marble steps like thunder. Traoré. Gaza. Justice now. Inside, Netanyahu sat in his suite, wine untouched, eyes scanning his speech drafts, not for accuracy, but for ammunition. His advisors circled like hawks, urging a response, a counterstrike, not on the battlefield, but in narrative. "He's turning the world against you," one whispered. Another added, "If we let him own the story, he owns the future." Netanyahu stood, adjusted his tie, and finally said, "Then we remind them who's always survived." But just as his team prepared a televised response, a feed went live across platforms, one that wasn't sanctioned, one that wasn't edited. It was Traoré. In a dimly lit room, sitting beneath the flag of Burkina Faso, he looked directly into the camera, not like a politician, but like a man with nothing to prove. "No more games," he began. "No more both sides. No more pretending war is peace. You threaten Turkey. You threaten Qatar. You close gates to starve children. And then you stand before the world and say the word security like it's a prayer." He leaned forward. "You've mistaken silence for complicity. But this generation hears the bombs. Sees the rubble. Counts the bodies." Then he paused, his voice dropping into something deeper, something ancient. "And now, you will hear us." He listed off the names of towns destroyed. The names of children buried. The names of villages flattened not by accident, but by strategy. And then he said the words that would end up on protest signs from Johannesburg to Detroit. "You can't murder peace and then claim to protect it." The next morning, headlines didn't ask for Israel's response. They asked for accountability. News anchors hesitated to repeat Traoré's words, not because they doubted them, but because they carried a fire that couldn't be softened for prime time. And Netanyahu? He gave his speech. But it was delivered to half the hall. Delegates from 30 countries, most from the global south, walked out in silence the moment he rose. Not in protest. In declaration. They had chosen a different voice. A different standard. A different world. Back in Ouagadougou, a schoolteacher rewrote the next day's lesson plan. Not about borders, but about bravery. About the day a man from West Africa stood against the machine, and didn't flinch. The day he made the world ask not what power says, but what power fears.